But this is something that I have been working on for a while. I did get some extra training in grief and just responses to grief over this past year because I've been seeing it. I actually work I volunteer at the counseling center here on campus, so I've been seeing it a lot there. But then I've been noticing just so many reactions in my students that I think can be conceptualized as grief reactions throughout this pandemic. And I think sometimes what we see as disengagement or so forth from our students is actually a grief response. So I just want to kind of share with you a little bit more about grief and then talk about how this can help you understand more, like how to work with students and just kind of maybe understand where students are and maybe even where you are yourself a little bit better, because I don't think this just applies to students, but it applies to all of us. I think we've all been going through a really unprecedented time, which is kind of still going. Please, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to stop me. I won't be able to see hands. And I think the mark of a good teacher is being able to read your audience. So please feel free to stop me at any point if you need anything. So I just want to take a brief moment. This is a blob tree, which is a great exercise for classes and working with individuals and just spurring some discussion. So I would just encourage you to look at all of the little blobs on here and see if there's one that you feel like you were before the pandemic started. So maybe like February 2020. And then one that you feel like you are now. And maybe even if it really radically changed throughout, maybe if there's one in the middle. But just take a minute and then maybe talk to the people next to you what you think. Okay. Well, thank you for your engagement in that. This is one thing that you can absolutely use in the classroom. You can see on the bottom it has the reference down there, the blob tree. Something that you can use in the classroom to start helping students talk more about their experiences, and just be able to share and kind of project what their feelings are out onto these blobs, which can be really helpful for them to try to explain like what it's been like for them to go through all of this. So the next piece, I know that these presentations are pretty short. So I'm actually, the video that I have here is 7 minutes long, and I realized I'm not going to have time for that. So I can send out a link for that. But one of the things that I think that it's really important when you think about healing and working through grief is to really be able to like collectively memorialize what happened and what happened for all of us. And, I think when people talk about grief, they're like, well, I mean, people did die during the pandemic, but you might be like, well, I didn't have anybody who I was close to who died during the pandemic. But I think it's still grief if it's a huge change in your life. It's still something that you have to navigate. And I love this. One of the trainings I did from Bidwell Smith, I think one of my favorite quotes from her was, we're not safe all the time, but we operate under the illusion that we are. And I think up until we got to 2020, many of us were probably operating under the illusion that, yeah, if I want toilet paper, I can go to the store and get toilet paper. My class next week will be in person. In a month from now, I will go to a wedding and it will be in this location and it'll be fine. But I did hear somebody say something about sending child to kindergarten. It's kind of like, well, operate under the illusion that I'm going to drop my kid off at kindergarten. It's going to be really hard. But then suddenly it's like, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do now? Like, what is schooling going to look like? And I think that in the beginning, it was sort of that feeling of shock of like, oh my goodness, how am I even going to navigate all of this? What does this even look like? And there were no answers. I think we were all just searching for answers, which is oftentimes what people do when somebody dies, like searching for answers, like what happened? How did this happen? Why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? Those are all really common reactions because we like to have that control and we like to feel like we know what's happening and what's going on, because it makes us feel safe. So this video in here, which you could certainly get the link, is really kind of an opportunity to look at what happened in that first year and kind of recollect together. And it kind of goes along with, let me switch my slide. So it kind of goes along like, what do you remember? And this is something that you can do with students too. Like, what do you remember about that? Like what maybe do you need to share that was just, even if it didn't feel at the time like it was super difficult, all of these little things added up. So, for example, some of the things that I remember from the beginning are watching the news about that Diamond Princess ship and how there were a couple people on there who had COVID and they didn't know if they could go back or not. Spring break, March 2020, that never ended. And suddenly it was like everything just quickly shut down within a week. The toilet paper shortage, the White House briefings that we had so often. And we were all, well, I don't know if you all were, but I remember being glued to the TV, like, do they know anything more? What should we do? Um, when there was a shortage on masks and we were all kind of trying to sew them, or there were YouTube videos on how to make them out of handkerchiefs. And, in the beginning with NDSU, where we were sharing Zoom accounts and we had to kind of go through the admin to get us something scheduled. And so I just want to take a minute, and this is, again, something that you can do for your class to create some connection and also allow them an opportunity to share what this has been like for them, to help build some community. So I'm going to give you just a minute to talk to the people next to you. If there's something that you like remember from that year that when you think about it, seems like forever ago, but it's still in there, like something that felt so different for you. All right, so we'll come back together. I can hear some of the interesting pieces that you're talking about, some things that I had forgotten too. But one of the things, I'm not recommending that you all become counselors or anything like that. But one of the things that I think it's really important for teachers to know, or anybody who works with individuals, is, when we have a reaction like this, especially when it's a collective reaction, there's a fallout. So there's the beginning part where we experience a lot of this, like, what is going on? And we're super confused. We're trying to make sense of everything, and everybody's just trying to do the right thing. And you think about a family when somebody dies, like everybody's confused. There's some fighting because everybody's trying to do what's right, but they have different opinions about what's right. But then it's interesting because what happens, which I'm actually going, I think, into my next slide. What happens is you start to move through these different stages. And so in the beginning, it's like, wait, what is this? And, we had a lot of people who are like, this isn't even real. A lot of people who are very angry about it, trying to figure out what they were going to do. And when I think about where we are collectively now, I think there is, when I look at if you ever read the Chronicle of Higher Ed, they talk a lot about the disengagement, across the board disengagement of students and also faculty members. And I don't know, I think they talk about staff too, but just that there's like, it's hard to get students engaged in class. It's hard to get faculty members to come to campus. I mean, look at me, I'm at my house, but so I think that and it signifies a lot of what might be a grief reaction and some depression of like, this is a struggle. Like, I'm still carrying all of these things that I haven't been able to process throughout these past, over 2 years now. And so I bring these stages up, and I have stages in quotes here because there's a lot of controversy around Kubler-Ross. When I went through a lot of the grief training, some people were like, that's really outdated. And in some ways it is. It's not linear. It's very recursive when you think about how people go through grief. But it was also very groundbreaking at the time that she created this theory, because nobody had really talked about what people go through when they're grieving. I also have a little star at the end. When she studied this, she studied people who are at the end of life. So it is a little bit of a different kind of a grief than, for example, somebody who is going through a job loss or things like that. So I just want to note that. And again, the reason that I bring this up is to help you contextualize some of the behaviors that you might be seeing in your classroom. Some of the people who aren't turning in assignments, for example, some of the people who don't, I think when you live in a situation where you don't know what's going to happen next, you stop planning, and you stop being, what we would expect from good students, like monitor your schedule, know when you need to turn them in. But because there's been so many changes and so many very fast changes that people have had to respond to, in our psyche, what we do is we start to just be like, well, that probably doesn't matter because it's probably going to change anyway. Maybe this will be in person, maybe it won't, maybe the assignment will be pushed back, maybe, and so we start to operate from a different framework. And you see this a lot in people who have been, they've experienced a lot of trauma in their life. It's hard for them to plan things because everything has been so shaken up. So you might see that in your classroom. You might even see that in yourself too. It's harder to get motivated to do things. I know people who I've talked to about research. It's very hard to keep doing your research and keeping up on it, because there's so much else going on psychologically and externally. So other things that you'll see in students or in yourself, I mean, I don't think when I talk about this, I'm framing it for students, but I don't think any of us are immune to this. I know I'm certainly not. I see a lot of this in myself as well. But these are common reactions to grief. And I think when people think about grief, a lot of times people think sadness. But really, there are so many different reactions to it. There are emotional reactions. I think in some ways, I was thinking about this last fall when I was feeling kind of numb to everything, and that's actually a reaction to grief too. Feeling like it's almost like you don't care, but you do care. But it's like the way that your psyche protects you from some of that overwhelming feeling. So I bring out kind of that numbness, mood swings, really rapid mood swings, irritation. I think that a lot of what we've been seeing lately, if you watch the news and people are so angry with one another, and I think we've become kind of polarized. And I think a lot of that is grief too. Like people become more entrenched because it's hard, because everything feels unstable. So when something doesn't feel stable, you ground deeper into what does feel stable, whether that be your religion, whether it be your beliefs about anything, politics, anything. You try to ground into that and hold on to it, because you want something that makes you feel secure in a world that feels like it's kind of changing rapidly. And we see that from students too. Physical, a lot of, I mean, I can speak from the counselor side. Counseling has become it's in high demand right now. It's very hard to get into a counselor. If you talk about people in the Fargo-Moorhead area, a lot of people have opened private practices, just because we are seeing so many people come in for counseling. And it's for a lot of these different things. And sometimes people will be going to their doctor too. They'll just feel a lot of muscle tension, having trouble sleeping, stomach aches, headaches. Those are all common grief reactions. One that you'll see in classrooms a lot of times that you might pick up on as educators is the cognitive piece. People being confused, forgetting things. I think I've had to remind students more in the past 2 years than I've ever had to remind students. And I work with grad students, and it's just like people just forget things. It kind of slips through the cracks. But your brain, when you're going through something big, you only have so much processing that you can do on a certain thing. And so that those little things that seem littler kind of fall through the cracks. Difficulty concentrating, making decisions, being preoccupied with death. And this is more of a death, like a death reaction, but so just some things that you will see in classrooms. So I think that I bring this up so that when you do see that, just to have some like, okay, this might be going on for this student. I don't know, but it could be something. Other reactions, behavioral, lack of interest in things. I think that I've seen a lot more of that recently. Just being like, no, it doesn't really matter, because again, when you live in a world that's really unpredictable, you start to think that things don't matter because it could change anyway. Avoiding things, spiritual, struggling to find meaning, anger at some spiritual source, confusion. Some people have really found their faith beliefs very helpful, some have not. So just keeping these in mind, because I think, even if you're teaching something that has nothing to do with grief, like engineering or something, you might have these side pockets where students talk about this, and you can really find some connection with people to help them. Other things that just kind of go along with the pandemic and the loss during that. I mean, this is kind of my slide to validate you all and the students that you're working with, just how much we have gone through in this past 2 years. I mean, the increased isolation, the loss of social support, the loss of our face-to-face contact, and some of that physical comfort. I think the loss of control is huge. And I think, it's kind of like when somebody is diagnosed with cancer. I remember working with cancer patients for a while, and they would talk about how even when they maybe they got a clear scan, they were in remission for all intents and purposes, they were so scared of the next shoe dropping, or how do they, yeah, the other shoe will drop, the other foot will, the phrase I'm looking, I always forget those. Anyway, but it was such a fear, a big fear. And I think for us now, we're living in this sort of like anxious state because, even when I saw on the news, they talked a little bit about monkeypox, and I was like, oh no, now another thing to worry about. Like, how does that affect children? What is that going to do to everything? And so you kind of live in this very hyper vigilant state when you've been through something that's very difficult. And that happens with students too, kind of living in this hyper vigilant, like, well, what's going to happen here? And how am I going to get through this if this happens? And then the loss of rituals. I know we're bringing some of those back with graduation and so forth, but it's a huge loss. It's a huge loss not to be able to send your kindergartner to kindergarten. It's a huge loss not to be able to graduate with your friends. And I think sometimes people downplay it, but it is a big loss. And even if we think, well, maybe somebody didn't die or whatever, it's still a huge loss to carry when that's been something that you've been looking forward to, even implicitly, because I think that signifies like, life, it's not just the event, but it's also signifying like life isn't always what I expect it to be. And that makes us feel really existentially anxious. And so that's why I want to validate that's a big loss. That's a really big loss. So the tasks of grieving, I know that I always run over time when I teach, but I'm getting close. But the tasks of grieving, according to Warden, this is some new research out there. But he talked a lot about just, accepting the reality of the loss, being able to really kind of like what I did in the previous slide, be like, you know what? This was a huge loss. Like this has been really hard. And being able to just validate that for ourselves and for our students that this has been really hard and it's still hard. Even if things go back to quote unquote normal, it's still hard because there's that threat there that you can't, you know, it's hard to take for granted now that we're going to get toilet paper, or even you think about infant formula. Like it's hard to take things for granted because we've had such a huge upheaval in our whole country and our whole world that we kind of live on the edge of like, well, when's the next thing going to happen? And how is that going to impact? And how is it still impacting us? So being able to accept that and experience some of that loss, whether that be just recognizing it for yourself, maybe talking to people about it, sharing what you've experienced is one of the most healing things that you can do. Adjusting to the environment. So I think sitting with that feeling of like, just like I didn't get to do what I thought I was going to do. And so there's an adjustment that happens there cognitively, physically, spiritually, that happens. And then finding some long lasting connection. Now, in this way, it's to the deceased or the person that died. But I think about this just in terms of finding some long lasting connection with your peers around you, to the students that you have of like, you know what, we've gone through this together and it's been super hard. And how can we connect through this and hopefully re-engage in some of our tasks together, whether that be re-engage in teaching, re-engage in learning, kind of together, but take it with some grace. I think just to be accepting of ourselves and what we've been through. I won't go through this too much, but I also want to acknowledge that, when we go through a grief process, we often go back and forth. So you might find like sometimes you really need to go into and really delve into like, this was a big loss and acknowledge that. And other times it's like, okay, how can I take a step forward? And that's kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth when we grieve. And any of you who have lost something or someone significant know that it's like, some days you're like, I think I'm doing okay. I'm moving forward. And then suddenly something will happen. You'll be reminded of someone and you'll just be right back in. It's kind of like square one again and you're grieving. So that happens and that's very normal. And that will happen to students too. Sometimes it's like, okay, I'm maybe getting my footing a little bit. And then shoot, I forgot my assignments. I forgot to do this. I'm forgetting again. So that is very normal. And then moving with and through grief, I think this is one of my last slides. I think one of the biggest things is to really be able to tell the story. Excuse me. Kind of like what we did at the beginning, being able to share your story. Like what was this like for you? How did you make sense of it? How do you continue to make sense of it as you go? Making amends. This is we talk about this with people who have died, but I think sometimes even thinking about situations Like being able to really, like, is there something that you need? I ask my clients that a lot. Is there something that you need in order to move forward? Maybe it's going back and redoing some of the rituals that you didn't get to do at the time. Maybe it's engaging in self-compassion and being able to be like, you know what? This was a lot harder for me than I thought it was. Like I thought, I was kind of meandering through this, but then I realized, gosh, I got really tired throughout that, or I got really angry. I was starting to get really angry or just frustrated, or I just didn't want to talk about it anymore. I wanted people to stop mentioning COVID-19 and just go on with their lives. So just being able to really think about, like, what was this like for me? And is there something I need to acknowledge? Writing is always a helpful thing, writing to other people, writing down your memories, um, being able to commemorate what this was like, finding ways to stay connected to what was lost, whether that be, a feeling of like a lost year, like I missed some of my students, even writing to your students that you felt like you missed during that period of time where it was all online. Actually, I just thought of that. I should do that. That would probably be reaching out to some of the students that I felt like graduated and I didn't quite get to say goodbye to them in the way that I wanted. And then trying to practice resilient grieving. We talk a lot about moving forward without moving on. So the video I have in here, I really like the second Frozen when Anna thinks that her sister Elsa died, and she talks about doing the next right thing. And so I think when you're moving through grief, it really is. It's you move forward, but that doesn't mean you leave the thing behind you. If that's a person or a situation, you try to find meaning, but it doesn't mean that it just goes away. I think that kind of invalidates some of the feelings of it and some of the enormity of loss. So I just think about, like, what is the next right thing for you? Is there something that you need? Is there something that you need in terms of your classroom or facilitating some movement with your students? I think this dovetails on what Dr. Danielson had done with you, the presentation beforehand, like maybe facilitating wellness for your classes or whatever. So I just would encourage you to think about that, what you might need. And I think I'm supposed to end at 11:20, so you have 10 minutes between, but any questions or comments or things I missed or things you disagree with, or which is I'm open for that. I always tell students, that's, if you disagree with me, that's great.
I really appreciate the aspect of kind of that collective remembering. I think especially as we have students who are coming into NDSU now who had a lot of the experience when they were in high school. Like for me, I think that's helpful to understand what high school was like, because my reference is mostly this is what college was like during the pandemic.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that was really, I mean, and I think about teachers, K-12 teachers that I talk to now, that was hugely disruptive for them. I would imagine more than it was for me, but yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. If you need anything or you want to reach out to me for questions or anything, please feel free to do so. I'm always happy to talk to people.